Faces here. I could be thanking everyone this evening, but let's just stick to the theme that we have. But I hope you allow me just 1 minute to mention the former director of Instituto Cervantes, Oscar Pujol, not only because he's one of the Spaniards who has such a vast knowledge of India and also of the works by Sudhir Kakar, but also because he's been really supportive in this project as well since the very beginning, encouraging me to translate the book because he knew very well the book written by Sudhir and Katharina, and also to present it here in Instituto Cervantes. Right, so I don't know, maybe you just would like to say some welcoming words?
Sure. Okay, then I'll start to just say a couple of words. Thank you very much, all of you, to come here. It's wonderful to see so many new faces. We are happy to be here. And the book that we have written, The Indians, actually came out originally 6 years back in German and in English, and then was slowly translated into other languages. And we are very, very happy that Patricia has done the translation into Spanish, and that this is now a wider community hopefully reading the book. The book was really fun to write because it's not only an Indian and a German, it's also a male and a female perspective. A lot of what is in the book is based on Sudhir's 30 years, more than 30 years of research, which we have updated, renewed, put in new perspectives. And hopefully it is a kind of aha, what we say in Germany, I don't know how you say it in Spanish, you read it, that you think, now I understand, why do Indians have their garbage out and not in the house? Or, and so on and so forth. So for us it was a pleasure to write that book, and I'll give the mic to Sudhir to add some comments.
So buenas tardes. This is what I learned when releasing the book in Spain. But in Barcelona it had to be done in Catalan and in Madrid in Spanish. Yes. I think Katharina has already said about the beginnings of the book. The main objective was that all the time one hears, reads, etc., India is a very diverse country. You cannot make any generalization about India. And our feeling was, continues to be, that we are so used, especially because of the discipline of anthropology, which Katharina has studied, to look at differences that our eyes don't see similarities anymore. It's not very modern to see similarities, but differences. How does this village differ from this one? And that we really miss the pattern of the forest because we're looking at trees all the time. So one of the main goals was, are there similarities in India, in at least the fields which we are familiar with, that is psychology, so in the mindset. So the Indian mind is really the objective here. And you can see an Indian mind or Indianness only if you compare it with other civilizations. One doesn't see it inside. So a person from Delhi is certainly very different from a person from Kerala. But are they both have more similarity, I think, if you look at someone, compare them with someone from, let's say, the United States. So you can only make civilizational comparisons. And this is, the comparison was always in the background. And the comparison was mainly with what we call also Western civilization. So it's a book about Indian identity. And I think it is, it was, of course, it has to be very controversial once it says that. But I believe this is part of a future one, because I think we'll soon have books on the European identity. At the moment there still are, you have books like the Italians, the Germans, the Spanish, I think we are headed towards a book on European identity also. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll give the floor to Patricia, who did a wonderful job translate.
Thank you. Right, so in fact what we are going to try to focus on tonight here is to have a fruitful conversation with you, to see, to try to contrast a little bit the Indian mind versus the Western mind. So I think that among the audience we have mostly foreigners, and for most of us there are many aspects which strike us when we reach India, so we'll just try to make a tour through these aspects. But I would like to start reflections on the book by a sentence that you have in the book itself in the introduction. I'm going to twist a little bit the meaning, if you allow me this time, at least consciously, right? It's on page 5 of the English version, and if some of you already have the Spanish version, it's on page 14. And it says, Indic civilization has not so much absorbed as translated foreign culture, unmindful or even oddly proud of all that is lost in translation. And here we come. Because even if they are using this expression in another context, right, I'm a bit surprised to see that they already had an opinion on what is lost in translation. I don't know whether to take it positively or negatively. I will take it positively. The fact that you are already aware that there's going to be a loss in translation, because at the end, well, there were many other translations before, and you have ended up allowing me to translate it into Spanish. So let's just take it positively. But today we will not focus so much on the translation process from a linguistic point of view, but rather from a cultural perspective, right? I'll just try to go through all those aspects or concepts that may have posed a challenge to me while translating the book, right? Basically trying to compare the Western perspective and the Indian perspective. And we just try to go over them to see how we could translate those difficult cultural concepts to the language that our Western minds can end up understanding, right? One of the main principles in translation theory is that the translator has to have a vast knowledge of the source culture, meaning, you know, the culture in which the book was written, the culture of the authors. I mean by culture not like the accumulation of knowledge that you both may have, since, you know, in this case it would be an audacity on my side to try to have as much knowledge as you have, but more on culture as this social concept, which is beliefs, values, you know, attitudes that at the end inform a society. So that is one of the main principles when we are translating any work, that you have to have that knowledge, or get to have an understanding of that knowledge. But recently, in translation theory, there has been some more emphasis put on the fact that it's not only the culture in which the book was written, but also that the translation has to be, when we analyze the translation, the assessment is culture bound, in the sense that, you know, the translator, in the same case as the writers, you've been immersed in a certain culture. Also, when the translation process was being done, the translator was also immersed in a certain culture. And in this case, as most of you know, I was already living here in India. So we have to take that into account when analyzing also this book in Spanish. But also because maybe you may think that the fact of, in my case, I had already been living in India for three years, but of course the translation that I have rendered now could be completely different to the one that I could have done when I landed, or it would be completely different to the one that I could do in 10 years' time, right? Basically, you know, I'm pointing this out because you may think that it was much more easy, the fact of being immersed in the Indian culture already, for me to translate the book, right? But still, at the same time, as I could have all those concepts already, let's say, internalized on me, and all those things that we are going to be talking about, that Western people, we look at them and we say, what's going on, what is this about? Some of those, we have already embraced them, no? And then I think the typical example, and most of the people present here could say, we end up using terms such as, of course, otobala, recio, kurta, gi, dal, concepts or realities that do not exist in our culture, and we end up using those terms already in Spanish without doing any kind of translation, of course. But then there are other concepts much more complex, such as, I don't know, we'll talk about it later, maybe dharma, karma, moksha, those concepts which are much more difficult to translate, and still we use those words. So up to a sense, we have already internalized those realities. It's already part of the culture that we are experiencing here. So I'm just pointing this out in order to show that even if it was a good factor, the fact of me living in India, it could also be a bit risky or dangerous, let's say, because those concepts were already too internalized on me. So I had to be aware of saying who is the target audience, who is going to read this book, and whether those concepts are already familiar for them or not, right? So taking into account all these kind of translation theory, I just would like to start focusing on those aspects. Those are the ideas that are striking to us. And I also have to say that the fact of living in India was a privilege in a sense, because of course I could understand many things, but also the fact of having a close contact with you. I think that's definitely a privilege. There are few writers who are so open and offer themselves to have an exchange with the translator. There's a German author who does that, Wintergrass. He holds a meeting with his translators into all the languages every time he has just released a book. And he's so aware of the translation process that he even makes theories on translation. And he says that translation is that which transforms everything so nothing changes. So I'm going to stick to that. That's what I try to do. So let's just see some of these challenges that I may have encountered while looking at the book. In the month of March, Instituto Cervantes has been organizing several events on the issue of, related to the International Working Women's Day. And I think it's a good point to start with, if you agree, to talk about the condition of women, not only working women, but women in general, because at the end these international days are just like the flag bearer of all the struggles that women have to face or go through. And especially here in India, I'm not just referring to the female feticide or infanticide or many other topics that I'm sure are going to come up later, such as sexual abuse and so on. I wouldn't like to fall into cliches, because in fact in the book, part that I found really interesting in the chapter that you dedicate to women, especially in the section of discrimination and the maiden, is that you point out that regardless of the objective facts that we have of discrimination towards women, after some research that you had done, in fact, at the end, both the traditional Indian girl or the middle-class Indian girl, both of them, they don't feel so discriminated as we would think. And I have to say, me being a woman, and I'm sure part of the audience agree on this, that it's a bit striking that statement, considering that, I mean, we do really feel that it's such a discrimination. So Katharina, how could you explain how come there's a difference between what we perceive and what they perceive and the objective facts that seem to be there?
Yeah, it's of course a very big question, but to kind of go in different directions. One is, India is a very heterogeneous society, not as homogeneous as European societies. So you have all kinds of levels. A woman who's high caste, urban, well educated, has a much higher status as, let's say, a low caste man in the countryside. So that already is a difference in how you perceive gender discrimination, just as one point. Then you have all these differences between countryside and urbanization, between castes, women in different castes, and so on. To give you one example, the burning of brides, the kind of killing of young women who have married but haven't given enough dowry, which is a common fact. I mean, we have hundreds of dowry deaths every day. This is what you might be surprised about, not a phenomena of the countrysides. It's an urban 21st century phenomena, mainly of the lower middle class, who want to have a big piece of the cake, of the material cake. And if things don't work out the way they feel, often the women burn. So you have different issues of discrimination in different parts of society and also in different geographical regions. So why do women or young women not feel that discrimination as we might perceive it? One reason is even though the facts, for example, that young girls in the countryside or babies when they grow up, female babies get less good malnutrition. They might see doctors less often, meaning they die more often. They might get less education. But all of that is not necessarily perceived by that subjective girl, because in the family there might be the mother, the uncle, and someone in the extended family who gives special attention to exactly that girl because she might be just one of many brothers, or in her character is outstanding. So the subjective kind of love and embeddedness is very much there. And I've just seen that now. We are doing a new book together, which is on women, by the way. Just started with the research, and the interviews have started. I've interviewed girls in Delhi who come from very, very poor backgrounds. They live in the slums. Their fathers are laborers or vegetable sellers, but they're very intelligent. So they got a scholarship for higher education. The kind of pride they carry within themselves, the way they walk through life, really astonished me. And kind of going deeper and asking, where is that coming from and who's supporting you? It is always the family. There's always someone in the family, in that case the whole family, because they are the first who actually made it, who get a higher education, and who are highly respected within their family. So that's one point of kind of contextuality. Then we have other things. People often don't see the actual root causes of discrimination. To give you one example, in the countryside, the dropout rates of girls in schools is very high. So girls turn 12, 13, suddenly there's a tremendous dropout. Why? Our first kind of perception would be, oh, they now become women and so on. They're needed for household work and so on. But some research that has been done in that area showed that there's a very simple answer: no toilets. The girls don't have toilets, so they are not sent, because where do they go? So sometimes there are very practical answers to questions, for example, of education. So the discrimination was not in that case mainly because they're girls, or they have to do household work at home, or they get married at 14, but things like there are no toilets and the parents feel unsafe for their girls, so they drop out. So one has to take all these things into consideration once one kind of judges or gets opinionated about discrimination against girls and women in India. That, of course, should not play down that a lot of discrimination is happening. I mean, I'm not trying to kind of play that down, but to kind of put it into a context that is more diverse than we probably think about.
Yes, I think there is also in that chapter you try to explain it a lot also from a psychoanalytical or psychological point of view, in the sense trying to deal with the society as if it was a person, in the sense that there is a huge gap between what we perceive in the society and how that is translated into how they behave within the family members. No, at the end, that's a little bit, no, what you were saying at the beginning. But it's interesting that you pointed out this issue of the dowry, which of course is very controversial. But quite recently, there was a minister of development in Odisha, I think, that just resigned because his daughter-in-law has sent a complaint to him because of dowry issues. So it's what you said. It's nothing related only to the rural areas. It's something very, very common that we have nowadays in the urban areas as well.
Yeah, more than that, the violence against these young women is more in the urban space, because in the rural setting, usually marriages are set up in communities where people know each other. It's a recommendation, it's someone from another village, there are relationships. So in urban spaces, many kind of set up marriages where the focus is on the material more than on anything else. People don't know each other. It might be from the newspapers, it might be someone from a neighborhood, but you don't have that kind of personal network, so it's much easier to lash out in violence. So that's one of the reasons why violence against young brides it's much higher in the urban space, especially among the lower middle class, where the wish or the hopes for material gain, it's much more important than, let's say, for the upper middle class who has enough resources. So
yeah, and it's interesting what you mentioned now about the violence. I remember when we were in Barcelona, you made a really good point on this, and what is the difference between West and Western countries and India regarding both violence and sex, no? That are perpetrated at the end in two different contexts. I don't know if you could talk a little bit more on this.
I think let me first
Continue
also
with, yeah, sure.
continue with, I think Katharina has said some of the main points. The discrimination, why it is not fair. Because of course it's a very patriarchal society, and the discrimination is written into all kind of patriarchal narratives. But the thing is, growing up, a girl or a boy does not get the culture straight. There's a buffer, and Katharina mentioned family is the buffer. So it was very strange for me to look, how would it be reflected in women subjectively? So actually one should imagine that in stories and songs, there would be a lot of violence between men and women reflected, because that's, women are very angry, they're feeling discriminated, and there will be a lot of male-female antagonism in stories, folk tales, where the society's imagination comes, songs, and this is not true. So this is in most of the states, this is not true. Compare it to, say, 1001 Nights, where this male-female aggression is very, very visible in the Middle East. This is not true of India. So then one wonders, well, then the second part would be, of course, that women get very depressed. They cannot express it, so there must be much more depression among women, because their feeling of self-worth would be very low. They're also very, very difficult to say. So what happens? And one thing is, as Katharina mentioned, is that there is perhaps someone in the family, this is not my family, sorry, who gives to the daughter that kind of love and says, you are worth something. But it also very much depends on the situation, the birth order. The first daughter, for instance, would not be discriminated against. The second or third, yes. After 3 sons, a daughter is very, very welcome. So it would also depend on where that girl is. So not all girls are discriminated, because at the same time the culture where it discriminates against the girl also looks at the girl as the Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, has come into our house. So it would also depend on where the birth order of the girl is. So it's not, one cannot so universalize these kind of things. And most important, in traditional India, there was a community or a group of women in the family. The women's part and the men's were very quite separate. So a girl, young girl, grew up for the most impressionable years in that group of women. And that group of women protected against the patriarchal ones. They would make fun of the men, and so in all the folk songs, wedding songs, etc., they would say, our men are actually infantile, they are faithless. So what the men are saying, that we are great superior, the group of women or family women where the girl grew up was saying absolute nonsense, they are stupid young people, etc. And you had that. So at the most impressionable years, the girl did not think that men are very superior or great, because other group of women were given this message. This unfortunately is breaking down in middle class, urban households where you have a nuclear family, where there's not this group of women to protect you. So it may be worse kind of discrimination being felt. Again, these are all the mediations of very certainly a patriarchal, but the reason why, otherwise no society can really work. No society can survive as Indian society or has arrived. If 50%, one of the most, not the most important part, felt it was terrible, it was absolutely wrong to be in this, and society cannot survive. So there has to be compensation offered by society of being a girl. If it is not offered, you are not going to survive.
Maybe I can add one more thing. Also, what we often don't see with our Western gaze is that women in Indian society, especially in the rural area, they have their own niches, but where they are very powerful, whether it's the control of money, what is spent on the household, or the older a woman grows and has, especially when she has sons and children and becomes kind of senior in the family, she has very different powers than the youngest, the weakest link in the family. So all of that also plays into what Sudhir was saying, that within that discrimination, there is a strange internal balance somehow that that kind of makes society or keeps it somehow stable. And in the urban middle class, one phenomena that gives girls of this generation a huge kind of boost of self-confidence is their capability to study and to take on a job whenever they like. It doesn't mean that they necessarily want to work after they get married, though most of them would like to. But they always can fall back on their own education. That's something that I've heard from every young girl these days. So that is something that empowers them internally. Whether they will have that power, it's another question. But they perceive it as being empowered and being kind of, that they're capable of standing on their own two legs. So that's a difference to 50 years back. And working education is not only accepted in these middle class households, it's even demanded. Gives a young woman a better marriage proposal, and so on and so forth. So it's very much part of a young girl's growing up these days, of getting hopefully a good education and good job afterwards.
It's basically you're saying that the family or the shangyams or the groups that they create in their communities are like the buffer for that apparent discrimination that can come from the society. However, and it really struck me when I was reading this recently in the media due to this unfortunate incident that has been happening, that happened in December. There's been a constant debate and reflection in the media on the role of women. And for example, I could read that in 2011, the statistics said that 94% of the perpetrators of crimes such as what happened in December were known to the victim. So we can say, okay, the family is a buffer, it's protecting the girl, the child, the woman from what can come from the society, but at the same time, the worst scenario that woman could face happens within the family or within the relatives or acquaintances. So, of course, there is this internal balance, but how can we explain that? How can we explain that such an expression of violence comes from someone that they end up knowing? It was not the case in the incident of December, but this has led to make a debate on not only the role of women in Indian society, but also how Indian society approaches such an important issue of human nature, which is sex, and which seems to be up to a point repressed. This is something that for us Westerners, we get really surprised to see the abysm between the India of nowadays, in which it seems to be a wasteland of sexuality or sexual expressions, compared to the Kama Sutra or any. So how can we explain this approach, and how come it comes from people that the woman or the girl is very related to?
Okay. I think most people and most families have always been aware of the power of sexuality. That is a very, very powerful force. And if you read all the old law books, when a girl should marry, it is that immediately after she gets a period, she should get married. And the main reason is what is then called child marriage. The main reason is the fear of what would happen. In fact, the father is not supposed to come nearer to the to the daughter once she is in puberty. So that in fact this distance, a lot of young women who come for therapy complain of the father becoming so distant, and they really hunger for that father. But there are reasons of that, because there is somewhere hanging this fear that nearness to a young girl would be very, very dangerous for the girl itself. So there is trying to protect her, but of course the protection doesn't always work. The reason, of course, is that there is no mixing of the sexes in the Indian situation, whether it is play, school, etc. They are kept separate, and why they are kept separate goes through a whole thing. The nature of marriage. Marriage is supposed to be not between two individuals, yes, but that they are separate. The couple is not the center of social structure, family structure. It is the parents and the son, so the girl comes in. So if the couple is not the center, it becomes very, very important for them. There's an arranged marriage. We won't go into arranged marriages because arranged marriages are of all kinds. It is not that you tell you to get married, but you can ask permission, you see photographs and how you meet. Now sometimes people come and tell their parents and then it is arranged. So they are of all kinds. But an arranged marriage needs this separation because otherwise if the sexes come together in school, college, people are going to fall in love and are going to get married, which then goes against the very basis of the Indian family system. So the separation of sexes is very, very important for that. But then of course what happens if there's separation of sexes, where are the partners available? They are available only in the family. So even if it is forbidden, so you have much, much more uncles, nieces, cousins, even incest, brother, sister, father, and much, much more. And it is somewhere the Indian society recognizes that. That's why all these kind of mothers become very, very vigilant when the daughter becomes 12, 13, of cousins, who is she going with, father, etc., not come near. It's not very conscious, but they're very, very vigilant. So, but still it would naturally, sex is a very, very strong drive, so it would happen within the family. So sex within the family is, I believe, it happens everywhere. I mean, that's not, whether it's Europe, USA, everywhere. But it happens more within it because it has no outlets outside, or up to recently, but the outlets are not available outside. So sex happens within the family much more. On the other hand, the importance of the family being together is, and that they should remain together, is so strong that no violence is allowed within the family. I mean, it happens, but that is something to be, any kind of differences of opinion, which can lead to any kind of violence, have to be suppressed. So violence gets directed outside. So you have much more violence outside and sex within. And this is, I think, what you were referring to, that I often see West as the opposite. West, the violence is within the family and sex is outside. So that is just a reverse part of it, if you look at it very clearly.
One is, one should not forget that also in Europe, most rape cases that are at least kind of policed, the person is known somehow to, I don't know the numbers, it's a little less than in India, but it's still astonishing that most people somehow know the rapist, or he's known to the family. So it's not just within India. Then you mentioned wasteland of sexuality. I'm not so sure if that holds true for India. I mean, what I've seen in India is absolutely the contrary. It is just not talked about. If I speak to, let's say, 20-year-old girls, and I ask them if they have a boyfriend, if they had sex, and so on, 95% would deny it. If I frame that question differently to the same girls, asking them, if take a number of 20 girls in your college, how many have a boyfriend? Suddenly 95% is a boyfriend. So it's a question of what is actually admitted to an outside person, or even, I mean, even in the family they wouldn't talk about it. So there's a lot happening here, especially in the urban space, but even in the countryside. It's just in the countryside, it's more in the family. In the urban space, they're at college and so on. We will be surprised how much, not just kissing and smoothing, but also sex is happening. So I know from a friend who is a teacher and young girls also confide to her, abortion rates are high, so that tells us something. So we, again, have to look what actually do we perceive and what is happening. But still, it is more a phenomena of urban middle class and of course also upper class India. And as Sudhir was saying, the opportunities are much more in the family.
But do you think that the fact, as you said, that it happens much more in urban India, is it maybe because they are getting much more influenced by Western ideas? Because quite recently, again, with all the repercussion that it has had in the media, all these incidents, the president of RSS was saying rapes happen in Bharat, but not in India. Meaning, it's just the West who is polluting us, and this is why it happens. It's a way of denying that it happens in the rural areas or in the deep Bharat, but I don't think we can.
He said the other way around. He said rapes happen in India and not India.
Oh, yes, sorry. Sorry. That's what I meant. You got the idea. That he was kind of blaming India as influenced by the Western culture and not Bharat, not the deep rural India, maybe.
I think it's total nonsense. I think this is just a projection of denial, of trying to hold up a certain image of India, which in that sense, on the one hand it exists, on the other hand it does not exist. It exists to the outside world, but not necessarily what is happening inside. As Sudhir was saying, sex is a drive that is not confided to the West or to, it's within everyone, and it's also played out in every society. The question is how open. And here it is much more repressed, for one, but also, even if it's happening, people just keep it much more private. And I think that's part of, So, I don't know, you have a slightly different opinion on that, so maybe you would.
No, I think, I think he should have said that rapes are reported much more in India, and they are not reported in Bharat. I think that would have been better. Of course, also there is part correctly because in Bharat, which if he means a small village, the number of people looking who can control it is much greater than in an anonymous city where the opportunities are much greater. So he could have also said rapes do not happen as much in Bharat because the opportunities are much less. They happen in India because the opportunities are much more. So he could have made those statements rather than.
Yeah, one can even add to that. Sudhir was once saying after the rape case in December happened and interviews were going on women, that in India you have a very contextualized perspective of perception on women, which is within their roles. A woman in the role as a mother, as a wife, as a sister is protected. So, and these models, kind of on the subconscious level of the mind, that especially men from rural areas or from very traditional backgrounds have in their minds, that's very strong. So any woman that does not fit these role models falls kind of in the category of being freely accessible for violence, for rape, for anything. So in that sense, the role models are Bharat. The other women are India, or part of India. So I think one could add to that.
But then do you think that this perception of a woman who does not fit in those categories, is it a woman that is too influenced by the Western culture or not? Because I'm still surprised about, this fear of being polluted with the Western concepts or the Western ideas, and I don't know why that woman that doesn't fit in those categories is not bad.
The women, we are saying that for many young men, say who are migrants to the city, who are new to the city, they have their models of women in mind, and those models are only relational models. As mothers, sisters, daughters, cousins, aunts. if the women they see in the city who do not fit in with that model, then they are not mothers, sisters, aunts, etc., but females, really, female body. And of course, it doesn't matter what the woman in the city really is inside, but if she doesn't fit in that model, of course the dress does come in. I mean, if the dress is completely according to what they've never seen, if the woman behaves completely which they've never seen, they would look upon her as female. Now, whether it is Western pollution or not, it is just I think the inability to recognize still in the mind that a woman can be a woman without being a mother, daughter, sister, etc. That is still an inability which is still not has come into the minds of most, or many men, I would say many men, who are coming to the cities, towns, etc., from the rural areas.
And then you have some things happening which are almost funny. Like, for example, maybe 10 years back, there was a demonstration by Naga Babas. These are the sadhus who run nakedly through India. Yes. And they demonstrated against the skimpy clothing of women, naked of course. So that is then very funny in a way, how what is culturally permitted and what is considered as morally totally unacceptable. So by coming to the point of Western influence, I do think, of course, liberal kind of ideas, what me as a German would call a liberal idea, that these things are through internet, through social media, through the urban space, transmitted in a different way. And it has an impact on the new generation, but it's not necessarily a Western influence or Western value. So I think we often think that all liberal ideas are Western ideas. I think that's maybe a bit out of proportion. So yeah.
I think I would slightly not disagree, but there is something. I think one should take all which is coming from, whether it is the RSS or the others, because it's not only the RSS, it's all the traditional parts of society, whether it is the Jamaat, Islami, they have protested exactly as much as you, so it's not really. I think one should take it's a big part of society, and one should try to understand what are they saying really. I mean, apart from these statements which we can dismiss very easily by statistics, etc. But they are saying, what are they protesting against? I think they are protesting against Western. But Western, not of the women as independent, that I think is a very welcome thing, that a woman has as much rights as a man, so the universal human rights, I think that is if that is a Western liberal import, perfectly, I'm all for it. I have certain problems with the other part which I think they are protesting against, which is the idea of the body. What is a body? And the Western idea that which is coming more and more, and which I think they are protesting against, that the body is only an arena of enjoyment, arena of fun, arena of pleasure, and there's nothing else. And that I think is very much which they kind of get disturbed about. They hold body to be much more the ideas of sacred to the body. It's a form of procreation. It's much more important. Sex is not just as somebody saying, or as somebody, some woman, I think it was an American patient who liked to have sex, told me, I like to use my vagina to shake hands. So I mean, that is not what body should be like. So I think that is the kind of thing they fear and are protesting, that kind of Western idea that you use your vagina to shake hands. That is not something. And they may not be able to kind of define it. They may not be able to give words to their discontent. This idea of the body is somehow not. It is, I think, that much. And that I personally am sympathetic to that. I think sexuality is a fire of procreation. One does not play with the fire as easily. Again, it should not be like completely inhibition. I mean, but one should not fall from the ice of inhibition into fire of complete self-indulgence. There has to be something in the middle.
I think there comes also a broader picture in it, the repression of sexuality of women, in that sense that especially certain kind of classes of men do not wish that women have a liberal attitude towards sexuality. I think also reflects on other anxieties within India. It's not a coincidence that RSS and BHP and all these organizations really became much stronger in the 80s and 90s when India opened economically, and when there were lots of shifts and changes happening. So especially the Hindu community, which doesn't really have a center, like in the, if you look just on the religious part. In the church, you have the Bible, you have one book everyone believes in or not. You have one community that meets at church at Sunday, and so on. In India, everything is fragmented. In a sense, you can go to the temple whenever you like. You can participate in certain rituals, or you don't. There's not even one ritual text or holy text that anyone needs to believe in. So there's a diversion that also makes often Hindu communities feel weaker to others. So that fear of being kind of overthrown by powers that are difficult to control plays into it as well, and it's played out on the bodies of women.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable, this part that, there's a part of Hinduism that has to be protectionist, right? That is understandable because it happens in other religions as well. But Hinduism as such is, as you said, it's quite fragmented, and it doesn't have this character of being so protectionist. No? It would be more tolerant or more open. So for me, it's a bit striking that suddenly we have these. You make these two categories in the book, no? The Hindu nationalist and the flexible Hindu. For me, it's striking that there is that part of the Hindu nationalist who is trying to reshape Hinduism, to make it more stronger, no? To put like barrier, no? To say this is our religion and you cannot attack it, no? Because in its roots, I don't know that much, no? But in its roots, I don't think Hinduism is so protectionist in that sense. But now we see this emergence of reshaped Hindu nationalism, no? And maybe it's that part which is overreacting towards any kind of pollution, no? Right. In any case, apart from that, let's say the part of the Hindu nationalists, we also have the other category, if you allow me to use that terminology, of the flexible Hindu. And that is also striking for us, not striking in a bad sense, but to see how the flexible Hindu, he's able to keep his traditions and combine it with everything that is importing, not I wouldn't say from the West, but due to globalization. No? Now we can see a Hindu practicing Hinduism like in a very modern way, maybe going to internet to donate to a temple, or adjusting or adapting the ways he or she was worshipping before to a very tight schedule. For us, this is, at least for me, is a much more striking situation, no? How Hindus can adapt to anything and just put their practices into the modern life, no?
Yeah,
it's much more than the protectionist part, no? In the sense that we all can get to understand that they try to protect their part of the religion.
Yeah, not having a problem with it in a sense that maybe you feel, oh, I can't go to church as a, let's say, as a good Christian. You feel like morally burdened that you're not doing your duty. But I think a modern Hindu has much less difficulty to do an online puja, to click and do his online puja, or just light a lamp. And so it's very, very subjective, and shortcuts are not a problem in urban modern India, because you have to live your life. So, but then you have, of course, the whole
range, no?
Range.
We can never generalize it.
Part of it, of course, comes also from history. I mean, India has been subjected to so many foreigners coming in, invasions, and so the idea of adapting, I mean, every cultural encounter which has come, say, first with the Islam, even earlier one, but Islam and the British colonialism and now the globalization. So all of these have not, the encounters are not seen as confrontations. All also, but they are also seen as ways to what can be assimilated from, what can be rejected. So Hinduism has been always been redefined and redefined and redefined. In fact, the idea of the castes, which is so strong, if it hadn't been for the Islamic idea of brotherhood, which came with the Muslim invasion, the caste would have been much more terrible in its consequences, and so that has really mediated it. Also, then the ideas which came from with the European colonialism, the Christian idea to love your neighbor. Otherwise, I imagine we wouldn't have had many kind of modern institutions like the Ramakrishna Mission and many other institutions which are very similar to the Christian institution that doing service to others. This was not a very Hindu idea. Like from the beginning, it was that service to the others. So these kind of so it has always been redefining, and I think the globalization part is also not very different. Technology does not matter. I mean, how one does it, I don't think it matters. Whether you say use internet for the puja or what you do about it. So that has never been that you have to stick to the letter of the law. So that has been a part of the history.
Also in the tendency, I mean, you have India as a country that is inclusive, and the West more as a country that is exclusive. Meaning, if you believe in Jesus, you cannot believe in Rama and Shiva and so on. While in India, you might have grown up as a devotee of Krishna, but if you, for some reason like Jesus, it's not a problem to put Jesus into the altar. So that kind of tendency of how you deal with other kind of influences, ideas, and so on plays out in what Sudhir was just saying, because the tradition always meant to, it's like a stream of tradition, the Guru Shishya Parampara, the teacher-student tradition, where you're an open vessel to all that your teacher tells you, and you just take it in, till the point comes where you add kind of your interpretation, commentaries, whether it's music or religion or anything. So I think that is also part of that openness of, first you just take everything in, but there's an openness, there's a space to change, to alter, to take other things in, to redress the goddess or the god.
Basically, we are defining Indian society as very flexible, or even resilient, up to a point. You also define it as context sensitive, in the sense that things are not as we conceive them in the West, that there is only one truth and there is always only one thing, as you said, you have to believe in Christ and that's it, no more options. Here you are much more not dependent on the context, but more sensitive towards the context, in the sense that there are things which cannot be considered only as a universal truth. We just have to take into account the context in order to assess a certain situation. And here it comes to my mind the typical example that some of us, we the Westerners, we would label as lying. For example, when an Indian person, you ask a question and he or she doesn't answer no, and just gives any answer in order to save face. But it's just, an Indian would argue that he or she is giving the most appropriate answer depending on that context, and that is valid, and also depending on the relationship that you have already established. No? And this is really a contrast between the Western mind and the Indian mind. No? Our mind works like there's only one option, no several answers, and the Indian mind works a bit like your truth can be valid, but mine as well.
You don't want to disturb the relationship.
I mean, there is what has been not the concept of universal. That is something very foreign to the Indian mind. I think that is a very Western concept of the universal church, the universal laws, thou shalt not. That has not been a part of the Indian mind at all. As you said, if you look at the old law books, all of them are, let's take one old one sounds very arcane, not to pee on the king's road, that is going to be punishable on the highway by by this and this, except if you are an old man, you cannot control it. If you are a very small child, you cannot control it. So there are always exceptions to every rule. So every rule has to have exceptions because the context is different, and that is a very, very important part in the Indian one. And the universal part seems very, very strange. How can you have one rule for everything without considering who the person is, who the rule applies, who the person doing it is, where it was done. Without that, how do you do that? So it seems very, very strange to an Indian mind. And when you look at even, you think you were talking about morality stories, and there you can start looking at and seeing that maybe Westerners will also start understanding. Just say if you tell someone a story that a boy, his mother is very, very ill, she's dying, and he doesn't have money, and there's a pharmacy there which is closed, locks. He breaks the locks and gets the medicine and gives to mother. Now, is it right or wrong? Now here I think even the Indian ones is absolutely right. There's no question of, I think even here the Western mind would start, is it right or wrong? I mean, he's stealing, etc. His mother is dying. For the Indian, absolutely there is. That's why corruption. I mean, I've never seen in all these years anyone saying I'm corrupt. I mean, people say, I took this money because I have to educate this nephew. So the education of nephew becomes the context. Is something because of that which is not corruption, and they don't see that as corruption. So this kind of the contextual way of seeing, I think, becomes very puzzling to Westerners. But in the context itself, the morality is very, very strong. It is not that the morality is not well done. In that context, it has to be very, very strong in a moral sense.
Yeah, like a Brahman cannot kill, but a warrior has to kill. Yeah, so within that context of being a Brahman, that moral is very strong. But I'd like to add also on this emotional level or the relational level. I mean, we all, I'm sure, have had that situation. You ask which direction is that in that place, and you get 3 answers. And it's like, why? And this is exactly what I was mentioning in the beginning. A relationship has, at that moment, been established. You don't want to disturb it. So it's better to give some answer than say no or give no answer. So in a way that is of course also true for other things. So the emotional bond that whether it's someone who's a stranger on the road that one talks to, or a conversation was that one has on the train, or within more deeper relationships, is most important, much more than for the Western mind. And I think that is something one always has to remember, that the answers are relational, and even if they are wrong, they are considered better than trying to, push that person away by saying, "I'm sorry, I don't know."
Yeah. Yep. I mean, basically in India, the concept of right and wrong depends on the context. While for us, for the Westerns, in the Western ethics, we really like to set that clear line. This is good, this is bad, and that's it. There is no in between, no. But in here, the dharma, no, the approach to what is right or wrong, or what we should follow, depends a lot on the context.
Well, what happens, of course, is that nobody can live by that, right, wrong. So in the Western also, you keep on breaking the rules. There is no way of living only one right and all. So of course, you get more guilt. That is true. There's no one who can just live by that rule at all. There are always exceptions also. It's only it is not recognized, or it is always it should not be.
Right, so this is in fact a little bit explained quite deeply in the last chapter of the book, when you try to explain the 3 concepts that set or define a little bit the Indian mind, not dharma. We have just talked about a little bit. But also we have karma and moksha. And for me, for example, this part of the book was one of the most new, let's say. I could have experienced some situations in which I was wondering why these things happen or so. But the terminology as such, being having Sanskrit and so on, was a bit new to me. I mean, for most of us, I think that even before coming to India, the word karma already rings a bell, more or less, and we know what it can refer to. But I don't know if you could just explain a little bit further what, just briefly, these three concepts that you use to define the Indian mindset, dharma, karma, and moksha are about, and how does an Indian person adapt it or use it, or how can we see it in the daily life? Because are very wide, abstract concepts, no?
Okay. Dharma, the rough translation is law, conduct, right conduct, what to do at what time. So morality, so that all comes under dharma. Karma, of course, I think everyone knows, which means causality, that every action has a reaction. So whatever you do, so not only do action, but even things, thoughts, etc., is something that will have a reaction, not only on the world, but also on yourself. And I think people, normal understanding of it is, because it is related also to rebirth, that your previous karma will have an action or an influence on your next life, what you do, how you are born, where you are, etc. Moksha is freedom, salvation's really freedom from life, or the cycles of birth and death, so there's no rebirth possible. So these are the three rough concepts. In the daily life, of course, dharma is the most important one. I mean, how does one act? So we only started with right and wrong. And here the main thing is that in the Hindu part, that is the plus and also the minus part. You can never know what is right and wrong. Why? Because you are told that right action, and we say the context, depends on the culture, time of history, which you are born, also your age, what is right for a 10-year-old is not right for a 40-year-old. Consistency is one of the worst things which can happen. I mean, if a 20-year-old behave the same way as a 5-year-old, you say something is wrong, but if a 60-year-old behaves as a 20-year-old, is also something wrong. So it depends also the stage of life. Then it also depends on your karma from previous life, which have left traces on you, which also you cannot know. So all those things you can really, together, you can never really know what and act, because all those things are important for actions. So if you do not know how to act, so what do? So then the rules are, that's where the caste or your community comes in. Well, act according to your community, your family, your caste member. So you won't go wrong, at least you'll be safe. Or act according to the sages, so the examples of great men, how they've acted, then also you're safe. But actually, you can completely say no to it because nobody can really know how to act right or wrong. So that is where the dharma, which makes for two very separate things. It makes for very conformity because you act according to, exactly according to say your caste should act so that you are safe, but you can also act completely new. So it also gives you permission to do that, because how do you know it is not right? You can say, no, I think I am right. So it is both, it makes for great innovation as well as conformity. That is how it comes into the lives of most Indians.
Yeah, and the scale of life concepts in India is extreme. I mean, in this country you find anything. From a laborious ascetic who sits on the funeral pyres and eats human flesh, if necessary, to the most kind of adapted life to castes and village rules. So you have everything, and that's, I think, also because of the contextuality and what Sudhir was just saying, that somewhere there's some knowledge inside that you don't know what right action is, and that gives you that freedom to choose.
You were pointing a little bit the topic of the caste. I think we're not going to go further into it. Let's just leave it to the audience in case they would like to ask some questions. I think we have covered some of the main topics, defining at the end the Indian society as flexible, heterogeneous, and quite varied. So I just would like to thank you for making such a fruitful conversation, for once more being so ready to answer the questions. And let's just see if the audience has any more questions to us. But thank you very much.
Thank you.